Hello invert fans, welcome back to Spooderpods. Today we're talking about setting up our dwarf tiger rump tarantulas enclosure and why we made the decisions we did in doing so. Now, the Trinidad Dwarf Tiger Rump is a charming dwarf species of tarantula. If you want the scientific name, it's Cyriocosmus elegans. Quite a mouthful, but I think we find that the scientific name is quite important so you can pinpoint which one you're going for. They're a beautiful species. They have this beautiful heart on their behind and some tiger patterning. The males and females vary in sizing, but generally, if you're setting up for a juvenile, it's kind of the same sizing, and later on you upgrade depending on what they turn out to be. If you have a spiderling, obviously most people recommend a vial or a very small enclosure. We would, based on the research we've done, agree with that. But let's talk through what the juvenile enclosure looks like and why we made the decisions we did with it. So here is the enclosure itself. I'm going to show it from a bit of a distance. It's got lots of bits and pieces in there which I'm going to talk about very shortly. We made sure that it was top opening and that all the ventilation was at the top where possible, purely because it is a terrestrial species. Some people argue it's semi-arboreal, and we have seen it climbing around, but they do burrow and spend most of their time on the ground level or hiding, and that's where they'll set up most of their web. So I'll veer on the side of terrestrial and occasionally likes to go exploring elsewhere. And for this reason, we did get an arboreal setup tank, as in rather than vertical, we went for horizontal, purely because it is a juvenile, it's so small. Later on, we'll probably change the setup slightly. Now, the overall enclosure size we went for is 16 centimeters by 10 centimeters. I think it was supposed to be 15, but we managed to get an extra centimeter out of there. Again, we wanted it nice and small because it is only a juvenile. It's only about 1.5 centimeters. As it grows, it can be upgraded, but there's still a bit of room to grow in it and enjoy it. Again, why we went for the kind of arboreal setup of this such a small enclosure is because of the substrate depth. We've got approximately 8.5 centimeters of substrate depth. The advice from people varies massively. Some people say it needs 10 centimeters, some say 11, some say it only needs 5. So we went for a middle ground because it's a burrower, but it's only very small, so that way we'll cover all bases and also make sure the substrate doesn't go above those ventilation holes because it could lead to drying. When it burrows, it could kick them out, and we don't want to lose our springtail colony, which I'll talk about now. As with all these enclosures, we like to have springtails in there just to keep any mold at bay, just to keep it nice and clean. They don't really require any maintenance, and our little dwarf tarantula is going to want a bit of moisture and humidity there anyway, so if they're not going to do any harm, it's perfect to have them as housemates for him. So let's talk a little bit about the other decisions. So we've talked about the size of the enclosure, we talked about why we chose that, talked about the substrate depth and why it's important. What else do we include? A bit of leaf litter and moss. Again, leaf litter to hide under and for our springtails, and a bit of moss to retain humidity. The other two really important factors, because we chose to go for a natural setup, are we put some branches in there that stick up approximately 2 centimeters above the substrate layer. That is to provide anchor points for our dwarf tarantula's webbing, so it kind of remains stable. It's also so if it does want to climb a bit higher and take a look at the world, that's also possible for enrichment. And then a big bit of cork bark with a little pre-made burrow under there. That provides a nice pre-made hiding spot and hopefully a place where our dwarf tarantula will emerge to come out to get its prey. So far, we haven't seen that yet. It tends to just go wherever it wants, but hopefully in time we will see more of that behaviour. There was some temptation to have some theming in this, which I've talked about in a previous introduction video, but we resisted. Wanted it all natural, wanted it nice and simple setup. If it turns out to be a female and it goes into a much larger enclosure, then maybe we can consider adding in a bit of thematic stuff there, but I feel natural is much better for this little guy, and I'm very interested to see what sort of webbing material is produced and how much more webbing and sort of anchor pointing we're going to see in the enclosure. One other thing I feel is really important to remember is you have to be adaptable when you're designing any enclosure. You know, you may design it in a certain way and then it doesn't really work, or your spider's using a different part of it, your invert's using a different area, so you have to change things up a little bit. I'm filming this video right at the start because I maybe will film a follow-up on how we've changed things or adapted things, because it is a learning experience having any sort of creature, and it's very, very useful to pick up on these things. We're hoping they'll settle in perfectly, it won't be any issues, but quite expecting at least a couple, and we're prepared for that and hopefully can learn from it. So guys, that brings me to the end of this video. I hope you found it useful. If you're getting a dwarf tarantula and you want to set up a little enclosure for it, remember terrestrial arboreal is going to have different sort of setups and different ways of doing things. This is more of a terrestrial kind of video. If you have an burrow one, maybe I'll be able to do one in the future. But for now, from me and our still unnamed tarantula, take care and see you later.